Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Morgan Lewin, and I'm one of the moderators of the Ask Historians, writing under the username aquatermain. Joining me today for this special mini episode of our podcast is our Flirt user, Avan. Welcome, Avan. Nice for you to join us.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to be talking about arguably one of the most traditionally requested questions that we've seen in our subreddit, and one of the questions that people usually have in general when it comes to European history, and especially modern and contemporary European history. Why exactly did the First World War started? So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So the First World War is that massive topic in history. It's been something that historians and popular media have been grappling with for decades, ever since it ended in 1918, and all of it leads back to that single shooting in Sarajevo on June the 28th, 1914, and it covers the start of the war, covers a period of about 2 months or so, from June to August 1914, and in that time all the great powers of Europe were thrown into the war. So historians have been trying to grapple with, firstly, what on earth caused such a cataclysmic war to break out, and then secondly, who, if anyone, can be to blame for that war breaking out. So it's a debate that'll probably keep raging on for centuries, and I doubt if you ask this question in 100 years' time, we won't have an answer for it again.
Yes, I absolutely agree that one of the interesting things about this is when we look at, for example, WWII, it's usually easier to kind of pinpoint a starting point for the war, even though it's not really that easy. But we traditionally go from either the invasion of Czechoslovakia or the invasion of Poland by the Third Reich and Nazi Germany. But in this particular case, we're talking about a very different sort of war, because it was, to a degree, at least in terms of diplomacy and international relations and geopolitics, it was a new kind of war. It was a kind of war that nobody had ever seen in this sort of scale. I mean, we call it the First World War. Most of the world didn't really care, which is something that we don't usually talk about when it comes to analyzing this war. I mean, calling it the First World War is a very Eurocentric perspective in general. I mean, the Global South in general was very much not involved, but it did have a lot of repercussions in the way we look at and the way we analyze geopolitics in general, right?
Yes, certainly. So, as you've mentioned, World War I is unique in the 20th century in the sense that it was a war that contained elements of previous wars when it started, but it was completely new in the sense of how those elements combined, and it produced a sheer scale of conflict that we have never known today. And the fact that World War II happened just 20 years afterward, and many people then attribute the cause of that war to the long-running effects of World War I, then, of course, that creates a sort of interesting comparison between the two, as we've already delved into. In terms of the impacts of geopolitics, the First World War is very interesting because it was a war in very much a Europe that was both modern and also fairly anachronistic for its time. You have great democracies like Britain and France and parliamentary assemblies, but at the same time, you also have old autocracies and monarchies in the German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, and of course the Austro-Hungarian Tsar. So Europe is very much the old world in the First World War. And yes, it is very Eurocentric that we refer to it as the First World War. I still prefer the name the Great War or the war to end all wars, even though it never really did. So in terms of geopolitics, what we have here is a war that involved all the major powers of Europe. And that has never happened before since the days of Napoleon, almost 100 years earlier in the 1800s. So analyzing the causes of this war, geopolitics is definitely going to play a major role. But we also have to understand that this was a different world to the one that Napoleon was rampaging across in the early 1800s.
I absolutely agree. I think that one of the most important differences that we can usually trace when it comes to comparing this to the Napoleonic War period probably has to do with the fact that at this stage, nation states were actually really a thing, like a real, proper thing. During the Napoleonic period, the very concept of a nation state was very much new in terms of in political terms. The idea of borders was very much not properly delimited yet. So it is very interesting that you bring up this concept of just how paradoxical the relationship between a modern Europe and its very much anachronistic systematization of government was. I mean, it is very important for us to consider this when it comes to analyzing the causes of this particular conflict. Because again, when you have nation states and when you have nationalism as a concept playing such a huge part in this particular conflict, it is very difficult for us to be able to discern and to separate this nationalism from the idea of an absolute monarchy, for example, which at the time was very much still a thing.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to touch on to that because that's a very interesting idea, the idea of nationalism. A lot of history curriculums and textbooks that I've been able to read in the course of my research point towards nationalism as one of the key elements of the Great War, or World War I, if we're going to go with that. So nationalism helps to explain why there was a shooting in Sarajevo, for example, and why the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip and supposedly had links to the Black Hand Gang and the Serbian government and Bosnia and Bosnian independence. But it doesn't help to understand why a war that could have been a localized war between the Balkan states and Austria-Hungary then exploded into a continental war with France, Germany, Britain, and Russia all taking part. So nationalism, in a way, gets us there, and that's sort of a theme with World War I causes. In isolation, each cause will get you some part of the way to explaining why the war broke out, but you have to look at all of them in combination to fully grasp. And even then, there are some holes here and there. You have to understand that there will never be a certainty about the First World War. All we know is when it broke out for sure, because we do obviously have the dates of the declarations of war.
Yes.
So we have to look at all these factors in combination. So it's dangerous as a student of the First World War and its causes, especially, to lean towards one particular factor and then, to the exclusion of all others, ignore whatever else happened in the few weeks in those months of summer of 1914.
I think that what the point you're bringing up is very interesting because it addresses something that is an issue in general in the historical discipline nowadays. This idea that has been developing in different historiographical schools that we need to stop being so concise. The historical discipline in general has always tried to be very concise and to analyze specific aspects of historical events. And when you look at something as complex and as peculiar as this particular conflict, it is important to be interdisciplinary. It is important to be able to realize that there are many different factors coming from different dimensions of human life. I mean, there were economic factors, there were political factors, there were even religious factors involved. I mean, it's not something that can be explained simply by this idea of, okay, Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and then everything just exploded. Because that's usually how you look at it. I don't know what your experience has been, but in my case, when I was in secondary school or high school, for our northerner friends who call it high school, I was taught primarily that the war broke out because Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then, coming and starting off from that particular point, you go on to analyzing other factors. But can we say in this day and age that instance, that a single moment in time, in a single place, is the only absolute major catalyst for something as massive as a war that lasted for 4 years and killed hundreds of millions of people?
No, obviously not. So yeah, when I was in high school as well, we call it that, where I grew up, and I'm still growing up, technically speaking. We do learn that Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the cause of the First World War. And when I learned this, I was immediately skeptical, even before I delved into the historiography and the writings on the matter, because there's no way an assassination. Yes, it was an assassination, tragic one at that, and a very high-ranking victim, but it was an assassination that how on earth did this assassination drag in entire great powers that had no business with Serbia and with Austria-Hungary or with Archduke Franz Ferdinand? And how did it drag in so many nations within a matter of weeks? Why was it not simply an Austro-Hungarian Serbian war, or as some historians have called it, a Third Balkan War? And it's interesting in history too, because 1914 was, if anything, a very peaceful year at its onset. Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, famously said at the beginning of the year that one had never seen such quiet and peaceful times at the Foreign Office. Everything in Europe seemed to be pointing towards that optimistic future of cooperation and peace that had been projected at the beginning of the century. This 20th century was the dawn of humanity's sort of hope in its own progress, and wars were confined to the past in many ways. So when this war broke out, it shattered that belief entirely. And it's so interesting that out of all the crises that happened in the first 14 years of the 1900s, this shooting in Sarajevo was the one that kicked off a war. There were already two Balkan wars before that. They did not erupt into continental wars. There was a Moroccan crisis between France, Britain, and Germany in 1911 and 1905 that didn't erupt into crisis. Why was it that in 1914, this particular event suddenly shot and lit the powder keg, so to speak, and caused continental war, the First World War? And yes, to what you've mentioned earlier, we will never be able to say that this singular event, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was the cause of the First World War. And it's a very reductionist, incredibly reductionist facet of school curriculums. But what it provides, if I have to defend it, is that it's a nice entry point for any student of history starting on the First World War. This event is well known. Even if you have not studied the First World War, you will know of an Archduke being shot in Sarajevo in 1914, and that kicked off some sort of conflict. So it's a nice entry point, but then you have to go further. And when you go further, it's very easy to understand the breadth of arguments that are being made, as you mentioned, about the economic, religious, even political ones as well. And so those arguments, I think, are what we should definitely be focusing on in this modern age. But Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is very much the entry point to those explanations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. I think that one of the... So here's the thing. There is a tendency still today in historiography and in the historical discipline in general to subscribe to many of the beliefs held by the historicist historiography school. For those in the audience who may not know, the historicism in general is a historiographical school founded by Leopold von Ranke in the 19th century, which basically created and cemented in popular consciousness the idea of the great men narrative. This idea that events in history occur at a specific time and in a specific place, and are the participants and the protagonists are men, important men, usually military men. In this particular case, when it comes to analyzing the situation, when we see and we look at the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, I do agree that it is an interesting point for us to start delving deeper into this situation, because again, this particular war is basically a historian's making machine. This particular war creates an interest, such an interest in history, that many historians get into the discipline because of it, because they start to learn through their work and their research all of these different facets that go far beyond the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And I remember I had a professor a couple of years ago in university who was telling us about this, and he had started getting interested in this in history in general when he started analyzing what were the effects that imperialism had as a cause of this particular war, for example, which is something that we don't usually typically associate, but it is difficult to disassociate the fact that during the entire 19th century, most of the powers involved in this particular war had been imperialistic powers.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing that your professor touched on, because imperialism is not too apparent of a cause of the First World War, and I personally ascribe to the historical belief that imperialism was not a major cause of the war, but it definitely helped fuel the war aims later on. So yes, you're definitely right. The great powers of Europe, all of them had empires. The Austro-Hungarian one was a continental one. So was the Russian one. The British and the French had huge maritime empires. The German Empire was new to this game, if you will, and it was late, obviously, owing to its unification in 1871, very recently to 1914. And so it was under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II. But again, avoiding the great men historicist view here, the general mood of the German public was also towards an empire. The Germans believed that they needed an empire to assert their hegemony over Europe. They wanted to be the masters of the continent. And they were very much already becoming masters of the continent. They had the strongest industry. They were about to overtake Britain in many areas of their economy. And they had absolutely destroyed the French in the Franco-Prussian Wars that had caused their unification. And their military was regarded as one of the best, if not the best, in Europe at the time. So this sort of mood of imperialism is there, but it's not a very present mood in all of the major powers. It helps to explain why Germany, for the longest time since 1914, before 1914, wanted an empire of its own. And it definitely helps explain why it sparked some crises abroad, such as the Moroccan crisis I mentioned earlier in 1905 and 1911. But it doesn't quite help us pinpoint why Kaiser Wilhelm II and his government decided to issue the famous blank check to Austria-Hungary on July the 5th. So it's an interesting bit of the First World War, the imperialism argument. But we have to understand that at the beginning of the 20th century, many empires had already viewed this time period as sort of the consolidation, the sort of restful period of their empire. They had grown to the point where the world had pretty much already been divided as much as it could be between them. Germany famously was considered to be clawing for scraps in this new world of the 20th century. So imperialism wasn't a major factor in all of the powers, but it certainly helps to explain why the national mood of Germany at the time, and especially Austria-Hungary, was towards, in the case of the former, the expansion of an empire, and in the case of the latter, the preservation of the empire. And that, of course, ties into the whole nationalism point, which we mentioned earlier.
So let's in the time that we have left, let's talk about these empires participating in the war separately. Let's talk about their separate motivations for entering this particular war.
Yes, I will choose. So I think it's logical that we start perhaps with the empire that wanted the least from these events in Serbia, and that was, of course, the British Empire. The British were very reluctant to get into the First World War. In fact, all the way up until August, their belief was that they could stay out of the war and it would become very much a continental thing, and they would be removed from it. And as a result, the general sentiment in the British is sort of sympathy for the Austro-Hungarians because they've lost their Archduke, but at the same time, it's general preference for isolation from the war. In fact, the Prime Minister of Britain, Herbert Asquith, famously wrote to his girlfriend sometime in June that there was happily no reason we should get involved in Europe. And the British only heard about the assassination on the 25th of July or something or other. And the amazing thing was that after the assassination, the British were still unwilling to get involved in war. And that was mainly due to several things. They were occupied with internal problems, with the Ulster risings and the fear of a civil war, which was very much a real fear at the time. And they were also concerned about why on earth they should get involved in a war that started because of the shooting of some Archduke down in the Balkans. Famous a British diarist from that time actually wrote, "Someone's always getting shot down in the Balkans all the time. Why on earth should this be any different?" And the reason why it was different is because of France, and it ties nicely into the French Empire. So Britain and France were not allies. I have to keep stressing this to every single person who asks about the Allied system. The British had no mutual defense pacts, to be more technical, with any nation in Europe. Anyone could go to war in Europe, and the British would not be obligated to join them, except for one key nation, and that was, of course, Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality in the 1839 Treaty of London. And so the Foreign Secretary at the time, Sir Edward Grey, he became aware of the fact that if he was going to justify entering the war on the side of France and Russia, he would have to make the casus belli, the cause for war, Belgium's neutrality and the breach of Belgium's neutrality. So when it became clear that Germany was intent on invading Belgium as per the Schlieffen-Moltke plan, the famous war plan, which envisioned a swift breach into Belgium and into France, the British immediately became more concerned, but it was still remained very reluctant. Even on the final day before hostilities were announced on the 3rd of August, the British Parliament was divided over whether or not it should go to war, and only after news had arrived of Germany's invasion of Belgium and the denial of the ultimatum that the British sent did the British finally go to war. France, on the other hand, had a much more innate connection. The French did have a mutual defense pact with the Russian Empire in the Franco-Russian Entente of 1892-1894, and so they had to go to the aid of Russia as soon as Russia was attacked by Austria-Hungary and Germany. But they also wanted to drag the British into the war, so there's this effort by the French to drag in the British, and the British are very reluctant again. They keep trying to see off the French diplomats and the French foreign minister's requests for guaranteeing military support and whatnot. The best they can do is guarantee that their navy will attack any German ships who dare to attack French ships in the Channel. And then you have, of course, the Russian Empire on the other side of Europe. The Russian Empire is the one that's most associated with this idea of nationalism and the sort of ethnic cause for war. And it's long been touted, this idea that Tsar Nicholas II and his government saw a sort of kinship, if you will, sort of brotherly link with the Slavic populace in Serbia that had kicked off the hostilities with Austria-Hungary on the 28th of July. So the Russians get involved for mainly this ethnic reason, this idea that they need to go to the aid of their Slavic brothers and crush the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which has long been a thorn in their own designs to expand into the Balkans and claim it as their sphere of influence. So then we have the man in the middle, if you will, Germany, the German Empire. German Empire is probably the most talked about in World War I, and for good reason. It has a lot of causes to go to war. It has imperialistic desires, as we mentioned earlier. It wants to show its nationalistic fervor and prove that it is truly destined to be the hegemon of Europe. And its Kaiser and the imperial government are also willing to support Austria-Hungary in this case. But we've distorted the historical narrative to the point where it makes it look like they were aiming for war, as in they wished to actively start the war. This was not by any means the prevailing sentiment in the German government. In fact, when the Germans issued the blank check to Austria-Hungary, they still demanded that Austria-Hungary move quickly to crush the Serbian threat. And many historians have argued that if Austria-Hungary had moved quicker and crushed Serbia, the other great powers would not have been so concerned to intervene in the way that they did, and that a continental war would have been avoided. A localized war would not have been avoided, but a continental war could have been averted if the Austro-Hungarians had moved quicker. So that brings me back to the Austro-Hungarians, the ones who actually declared war first on Serbia on the 28th, 29th of July, 1914. There's a lovely quote by Margaret Macmillan, whose book I highly recommend on the First World War, and she says that the Austro-Hungarian government moved like a jellyfish with indigestion, and many other historians remark on this as well. The Austro-Hungarian government is not willing to move quickly on the question of Serbia, even after it's gained German support. And the reason for this is threefold. Firstly, the Hungarian prime minister, he is unwilling to give his support for the cause of crushing Serbia for a fair bit of time in July. And then another thing is just the reluctance of the Austrian government to go to war. They fear that if they go to war now, then the great powers will see what is happening in the Balkans and they will jump in and they will mediate in some sort of conference of the ambassadors, and they're going to seek a peaceful solution that is into Austria's best interests. The third factor is probably the most astounding of them all. Believe it or not, when the Austro-Hungarians were making the decision to go to war, they would not hurry up the ultimatum to Serbia because their troops were on harvest leave. That's right. The Austro-Hungarian troops were on harvest leave until the 23rd of July, and they would not end that leave early because they fear that if they did, the economy would collapse, because Austro-Hungary is mainly an agricultural nation, according to the Army General Staff. And they also fear that if the army is recalled from general leave, then there will be panic amongst the other European powers. So you have all these interlocking courses and decisions and sort of motives that link each of the great powers together, so that by the 4th of August 1914, when Britain does declare war on Germany, all of them have a stake in what has been initially a minor scuffle over the shooting of some Archduke in Sarajevo. Now, I should note here, it's actually a bit tragic that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the person assassinated, because if anything, he might very well have been the person who was the most likely to mend the rift between the Balkan states and the Slavic populations there, as well as the Slavic populations in the Austro-Hungarian provinces. He had the idea of what was called a trialist empire, in which the Slavic populations would get the same representation and rights that the Austrians and the Hungarians had in the dual monarchy. It was very unpopular among his family and among the ruling class. In fact, his uncle, the actual Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, was very pleased to see him go off to Sarajevo on that business, because he could finally get away from trying to preach the trialist idea to him and his advisors. So it's tragic that they chose to shot the man who might very well have been able to prevent this rift from getting any wider. But it is a tragic footnote in the otherwise even more tragic series of events and decisions that lead up to the First World War becoming such a massive conflict and such a hallmark event of the 20th century that we know it as today.
Well, this has been fascinating as always. I think that we should definitely do an episode following this one about the continuing conflicts within the war, because we don't have a lot of time left in this particular episode. But it has been fascinating, and thank you very much, Avan, for taking the time to join us and to come to our podcast, because this is an issue that, again, we get asked about a lot in AskHistorians. And it is always something. There's always something to be talked to be discussed when it comes to analyzing the Great War and its causes.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for having me on here. It was a pleasure to talk about it in brief, and I definitely think that we should have another follow-up podcast. I'd be very interested in coming and delving into it a bit more with the narratives and the dates and all the specifics that we've been a bit skimping on for time constraints in this episode.
Well, this has been Morgan Lewin, and we are signing off for the AskHistorians podcast. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.